I am so fucking sick and tired of lies being dressed up as help. I'm tired of watching humans be reduced to categories. I'm exhausted with watching pain get turned into identity. I'm fed up with watching people be told who they are based on what hurt them. The damage being done is real. A human being is not a disorder. A human being is not a diagnosis. A human being is not a symptom profile. A symptom is a signal. In clinical terms, a disorder is not something a person is. It is a pattern of symptoms that tend to appear together under certain conditions. Every diagnostic manual defines a disorder as a cluster of observable symptoms measured over a period of time that can change, remit, intensify, or disappear. There is no diagnosis that exists without symptoms. There is no disorder that is not, by definition, descriptive rather than essential. Which means this is not philosophy. It's fact. A disorder is a name for a pattern of symptoms. Symptoms are expressions of distress or adaptation. They are not an identity. No diagnosis describes a person's character, soul, capacity to love, or future. It only describes what was visible at a specific point in time. It is not a self. So, labels of disorders and diagnosis that do not include that fact become identities and cause shame. Because here's what happens once that fact is omitted. It doesn't just disappear. It gets absorbed. When someone is given a label without context, without being told, this is a description of symptoms, not a definition of who you are, the nervous system fills in the gap. And what fills the gap is shame. Because the human brain is meaning making. So instead of hearing, this is what your system learned to do in order to survive, what people hear instead is, this is who you are. And once identity collapses into symptom, the conclusion is brutal and immediate. Something is wrong with me. Not happening to me, not moving through me, not responding in me. It's me. And that's how shame is born. Not from the symptom, but from the omission. And once shame is internalized, this is when people cling to the label. Not because it's accurate, but because it explains the pain. Because even a painful identity feels safer than ambiguity. At least if I say, this is who I am, then I don't have to sit in the terror of, what if I could change? What if it wasn't permanent? What if more was possible and I lost time believing it wasn't? That's why people defend labels violently. They're not defending science. They're defending the scaffolding that held them together when nothing else did. Take away the label without restoring dignity, agency, and context, and it feels like annihilation. And this is where the conversation gets twisted. Because the moment someone challenges the way labels are used, they get accused of being anti-science, in denial, dangerous, invalidating, misinforming. But this isn't anti-science, nor is it misinformation. This is accurate science being rescued from misuse. Science describes patterns. Institutions turn descriptions into identities. Culture turns identities into verdicts. That's the distortion. Naming that is not denial, it's precision. I'm not saying symptoms aren't real or that suffering is not real. And I'm not saying support isn't necessary. What I'm saying is context was removed, humanity was removed, time was removed. And then people were told to live inside the leftover shape. So when I refuse labels as identity, when I refuse to let symptoms define a human being, when I refuse to accept language that strips people of future, that is not avoidance. That is ethical clarity. Because the moment we forget that symptoms are signals, we stop listening. And when we stop listening, we start judging. And when we start judging, we stop seeing humans at all. That's the cost of the omission. Not confusion or disagreement. Dehumanization. And somewhere along the way, we forgot that. Or worse, we chose to forget it. Because forgetting is profitable. These labels were never meant to describe the truth of a person. They were meant to organize behavior. They were meant to standardize treatment. They were meant to make systems manageable. And at some point, that convenience turned into identity. So now people don't say, I'm struggling. They say, I am this. As if the most wounded expression of a human nervous system is the final word on who they are. It's fucking not. I refuse to identify with labels. Not because I'm in denial or because I'm avoiding responsibility, but because I actually take responsibility seriously. And reducing myself or anyone to a category is the laziest, most spiritually bankrupt form of responsibility there is. It says, this explains everything. This predicts everything. This limits everything. And then it quietly removes hope. I have seen what people say about other humans once a label is attached. I've seen people say things like, they never change. They're impossible to love. They're dangerous. They're a dumpster fire. They should never be parents. Do you hear how fucking inhumane and demoralizing that is? That's not concern. It's not boundaries. That is dehumanization. That's deciding an entire category of people is disposable because it makes the world feel simpler. And I will not participate in that. Here's what I know to be true. People don't suffer because they're broken. They suffer because something happened without enough support, safety, or repair. Pain does not mean defective. Intensity does not mean dangerous. Emotion does not mean incapable of love. What actually determines whether someone causes harm is not what happened to them. It's whether they are willing to be conscious, accountable, and honest about impact. And I have met people with 0 labels who refuse all accountability. And I have met people with deep histories of pain who take responsibility with more integrity than anyone else in the room. So miss me with the bullshit shortcuts. Using a label to avoid accountability is just as fucked up as using a label to condemn someone else. I can't help it. That's just how I am. That's my wiring. No. If you have awareness, you have responsibility. If you can name something, you are now accountable for how you meet it. That goes both ways. Trauma explains behavior. It does not excuse it. Having pain does not give anyone the right to hurt others without repair. But here's another part that also gets twisted. It's not just people who carry labels who use them to avoid accountability. No. Some of the most damaging misuse of labels comes from the people who don't have them. The people who never get named, never get examined, never get asked to change. They learn how to use other people's diagnosis as weapons, as a way to stay comfortably unaccountable. They point and they say, that's your trauma. That's your disorder. That's your instability. So they never have to look at their own behavior. And let's be honest, the people who hide behind other people's labels are often the most avoidant, the most manipulative, and the most dangerous to the relational fabric of our entire society. Because they remain invisible. They don't seek help. They don't do the work. They don't reflect. No, they let someone else carry the pathology while they sit clean, unnamed, and untouched. And that inversion, where the person doing the work becomes the problem, is one of the most toxic dynamics there is. And this dynamic doesn't stay abstract. It plays out in real relationships every single day. There are people living inside relationships where they are told they're being helped, when in reality they're being blamed, insulted, diminished, and kept as the problem. They're the ones seeking support, reading the books, doing the work, learning the language, trying to be accountable. Meanwhile, the other person sits back and says all the right things. I'm so sorry you're suffering. I'll help you however I can. I'm here for you. And then does nothing. All of the pressure, growth, and performance gets placed on the person who is already trying their hardest. That's not partnership. That's displacement. And then, here's where it gets even darker. That person goes to therapy, looking for clarity, looking for help, figuring out how to name what's happening, looking for language to bring back to the relationship. And instead of being helped to see the full dynamic, they're handed the same conclusion they already live with. You're the problem. So they leave therapy carrying even more doubt, even more self-blame, even more responsibility. And they walk right back into the same relationship with the same unresolved harm. And now, a professional stamp reinforcing it. That's not healing. That is a closed loop of gaslighting, where the person doing the work is sent back to keep carrying what never belonged to them in the first place. What I'm exhausted by is watching people use psychology to escape conscience. Calling someone a monster instead of setting a boundary. Calling someone disordered instead of saying, I don't have capacity. Calling yourself broken instead of saying, I need support. Everything gets flattened. Nuance disappears. Humanity disappears. And everyone walks away feeling righteous and empty. I don't have any patience left for any of it. I don't have patience left to keep waiting for systems to become ethical. I don't have patience left to keep being told that this reduction, this cruelty, this intellectual laziness is just how it is. I can't live in a world where the price of belonging is self-erasure. Here's what I stand for. And I'm not soft about it anymore. Humans are allowed to change. Humans are allowed to grow. Humans are allowed to heal without being tracked forever by their worst moments. Here's the final layer. The one people are afraid to or don't know how to name. The psychiatrists, the doctors, the therapists, Not all of them, but enough of them. The ones who sell labels as solutions, who hand out diagnosis without context, who mistake naming for understanding, who confuse categorization with care. They offer a label as if it's clarity, but never explain that it's descriptive, temporary, and incomplete. So instead of restoring orientation, they freeze a moment of suffering into an entire identity. And that's not neutral. Because once a person believes, this is who I am, instead of this is what's happening, their future quietly narrows. What gets sold as help becomes a trap of a looping, repetitive hell, simply because context was withheld. And when context is missing, authority fills the gap. So you end up with a system where the person doing the work gets pathologized, the person avoiding accountability stays unnamed, and the professional gets to feel helpful without ever challenging the real dynamic. That's not healing. That's a machine that keeps pain moving in circles while calling it progress. This is why I refuse to let labels stand alone. Because when they're offered without humanity, without development, without relational truth, they don't liberate. A diagnosis is not a fucking prophecy. A symptom is not a sentence. And no one gets to decide who you are based on what you survived. If you need labels to orient yourself temporarily, fine. If they help you get support, good. But the moment a label becomes your identity, or someone else uses it to define your worth, your capacity to love, or your right to exist fully, that is where I draw the line. Hard. I am not here to be easily digestible. I'm here because the lie has gone way too far. And I'm saying it out loud. You are not what hurt you. You are not what overwhelmed you. You are not the language someone used to simplify your pain. You are human. And that should have been enough from the beginning. That's the truth. And I'm done pretending it needs to be softened to be valid.